Welcome to the Language Fuel podcast. Our mission is to fuel the teaching and learning of languages worldwide. I'm your host, Joanna Smith. Hello and welcome to the Language Fuel podcast episode number 21. I do apologize, it's been a little while since we've published the previous episode of the Language Fuel podcast. We've been super busy doing a whole bunch of stuff, including moving offices here at our home office and publishing some more courses. And that's something that's very exciting because that's something we've been wanting to do and have been planning for. Our latest course, in case you are not aware yet, is called Harnessing YouTube with Meaningful Listening Tasks. So head on over to www.languagefuelacademy.com and check that out. You can do a free trial which lets you into the first few exercises so you can get a taster of what that course is all about if you're interested. And just in terms of what it is about, it's about finding these fantastic texts, these authentic listening texts that you can see on the YouTube, and there are literally thousands and thousands of texts at your fingertips, assuming you're not teaching or studying a very rare language. But it's how do you actually make listening tasks that are meaningful for students? Just listening to a video alone is not going to make somebody or not going to increase their listening skills. So it's all about breaking the video down into specific meaningful tasks depending on your learners. So there's macro tasks and micro tasks. Anyway, I won't give too much away. You should check that out yourself. So now we've finished a couple of those big projects and it's time to get back onto the podcast. I've got several topics in the wings, and today's topic is about dictionaries, to use or not to use dictionaries, particularly in assessments. So this topic came up because recently I had the privilege of being an observer at a meeting of language teachers here in Auckland who were discussing the New Zealand Certificate of English Language, the qualification that is being a little bit revamped. One of the hot topics in that meeting was about dictionary use during assessments. Now, one of the issues with dictionary use is whether or not students are allowed to use electronic dictionaries versus printed dictionaries. I'm not super familiar with teaching languages other than English in this regard as to whether or not there are electronic dictionaries. Certainly mobile phones have apps, I'm sure, for many different languages where you could quickly type in a word and then get a translation, at the very least, a rough translation. So I'm pretty sure electronic dictionaries are a possibility in any language classroom. So the discussion sort of went, should we let them use their electronic dictionaries or should we force them to use printed dictionaries? Now, I guess, why would that even be an issue? For a start, these electronic dictionaries, the quality is just an unknown factor. There are dictionaries and there are dictionaries in the printed realm as well as in the electronic realm. I guess in the printed realm, if you are seeing which dictionary a student is using, and presumably it would be a class set that's available for somebody taking an assessment, you would know exactly what kind of dictionary they were using and you could be, confident of the quality. With an electronic dictionary, whether it's an app within a smartphone or whether it's a device on its own, it could be any kind of quality. So there could be a one-to-one translation where a word in their mother tongue is supplied and then in return they're getting one word in the target language. Now, as I'm sure you're aware if you're a language teacher, which is why you'd be listening to this, a one-to-one translation simply isn't always the right way to go. There may be several different nuanced options that a very good dictionary would be able to provide. And the other thing about electronic dictionaries, particularly those who are for students who are using an app for the dictionary, is of course that the device itself, whether it's the smartphone or tablet or something, could potentially be internet capable and potentially have other functions like photographing. So then the door opens up to plagiarism issues. They could very quickly take a picture of the page, the assessment page, send it to others who are about to do the same test or who are in the same room, who knows? So suddenly the idea that it may not be authentic work on the page is an issue. So those were the sort of the issues around whether or not electronic dictionaries were acceptable. On the other hand, there was a strong voice in this discussion that said, well, hey, look, we need to just test students for what they can do. If they're using a bad quality dictionary, well, they should just have the consequences of that. And or, they use electronic dictionaries all the time in their daily life, so why would we prevent that from happening during an assessment? So there is a bit of an argument there that, well, you need to be realistic about the language learning behaviors or the language behaviors of your students. And, if they're reliant on these electronic dictionaries and they're not that good quality, well, they simply just won't do such a good job in the assessment anyway. So there was definitely a voice of that in the assessment discussion. The other issues that came up, as you're probably aware, when you're discussing any kind of assessment, the two main things you need to think about are reliability and validity. Now, reliability in an assessment simply means, you'd get the same result each time. So there's consistency in the kinds of results you're getting. And of course, in the context of the discussion that I was observer to, that means that it's consistent across different institutions if they're all offering the same qualification, that there is a consistency in the way the exam works and that the students are being asked to do very similar things. So of course that became an issue, that if one institution allowed dictionaries of any sort in the assessment room, then all the other institutions would have to as well. Otherwise the assessment's not reliable because you'd get very different results in different places. So certainly that consistency is important. And then validity is about measuring what you really are aiming to measure. And if you're aiming to get an idea of how somebody can work with the language that you're teaching, then isn't it a good idea? So the argument goes to let them use whatever real life tools they use normally, in which case they are used to having a tool such as an electronic dictionary or any dictionary in their day-to-day life when they need it. So why wouldn't you let them do that in an assessment? So there is definitely an argument to be had there as well. Let the students use whatever tools they're used to using, because that's a better indication of how they're going to get by in the language in the day-to-day life. So a sense of authenticity. And the natural, restriction on that is that if they're relying too much on a dictionary to complete a task, it's going to take them too long and they won't complete it. So it's a natural limit to their reliance on the dictionary anyway. So, and there's definitely validity in that argument. Now, I'm certainly not going to provide the right answer. I don't think there is a right answer to this question. And if you're thinking about the same things for any assessments that you're providing your students, you'll, have to take into consideration some of the issues that you're facing. So in the group of teachers that I was observing, obviously they had a compliance issue. If this is a national certification that we're awarding, a national qualification, then we all need to approach it the same way. And I appreciate that. So that is definitely a compliance issue for consistency across the curriculum. But in any case, it is definitely a good idea, no matter what outcome you decide for the assessment, to at least teach the students good dictionary skills. If you let them use a dictionary in the assessment, at least make sure they're using it well. Even if they're not using a dictionary in an assessment, in their day-to-day learning, they should know how to use a dictionary well. It's a little bit unreasonable to expect any language learner to never use a dictionary, so you may as well inform them of best practice dictionary use. And I have had a question from one of the members in the language field community about how do you teach dictionary skills. So I thought I'd just briefly outline a few things that are important when you're working with dictionaries. So first of all, if you're thinking about absolute beginners and, everybody starts somewhere, it's important to think about understanding alphabetization of a dictionary. Many learners come from languages where there is not necessarily the same Roman alphabet as there is in English. I'm talking about English teaching in particular here, but obviously it could go the other way around. An English speaker learning, say, Hebrew or Arabic with a very different script, or an Indian language with a very different script. How do you actually look up a word? So for beginners, that is a skill which needs to be trained and practiced. Now, obviously with electronic dictionaries, you could probably type in a word rather than flicking through and needing to know the order of the alphabet. In my day, and certainly my mother's day, knowing the alphabet backwards was a very good skill. So my mother has taught my children the English alphabet backwards. I honestly don't know if they will ever really need to use that skill in today's day and age, but they know it. So if they're flicking through a dictionary backwards, they know, what the next one is when they're kind of going backwards, flipping back and forth. They know the alphabet. So whether you want to go that far to teach it to them backwards, certainly you need to teach it to them at least forwards so they can understand the idea of alphabetical order. In Indonesian, there is an issue that most verbs, in any case, are in their root form. And the root form may not appear in a text. If they were reading, it would have a prefix according to whether it was active or passive and so on. So I would have to know as a learner that when I'm looking up that word, I need to figure out what the base form is in order to find it in the dictionary. It will not be in the dictionary the way that I'm seeing it in the text. So if you're teaching a language that has prefixes and suffix, well, certainly prefixes, then make sure the learner understands what they need to be looking up in the dictionary to get that information. Then, of course, all the information after you have found the word, which is very much a beginner's level, you need to make sure your learners understand the information that's presented to them under that entry. Now, this is where dictionaries really stand apart from one another. Like I said earlier, if the dictionary simply provides a one-word translation, I would not be encouraging my students to use that dictionary. It's not enough information for students who are learning. There needs to be some information on pronunciation. Now, I'm very conscious that there are different systems for indicating pronunciation. Personally, I'm a fan of the International Phonetic Alphabet, or at least the phonemic alphabet within that language. And that is something that you will probably need to teach your students if you're working in a language where the pronunciation is not necessarily very closely linked to the spelling. So in English, many dictionaries do use the IPA, and it's important to help learners understand those symbols. And again, if you're not familiar with them yourself as a teacher, you'll need to learn them. And just so happens that we have a course on the Language Fuel Academy, which will introduce you to phonetics, and you'll find that at languagefuelacademy.com. So pronunciation, definitely, because as a learner, I want to know how to say the word, not just how to spell the word. Very, very important. The second thing which you really need to make sure is in there are grammatical information, such as is it a noun, is it a verb, is it an adjective, and if it's the kind of a word that actually can take a suffix that might change the word class, such as in English, adding ly can translate a word into an adverb, then have they got that information in the dictionary? How do I alter this word to make it fit in different positions in my sentence or to change the meaning of it? So all that kind of grammatical information also needs to be there for sure. Even things like, is it a transitive verb or an intransitive verb? And if we're talking about verbs, of course, does it take an object or no object? A third very useful thing to have in a dictionary entry is collocations. What other words often go with this one? So in English, we might have phrasal verbs, pick up, put down. There are two parts. They should actually have their own dictionary entry because pick up is a very different word from the word pick. So it should be in its own entry. However, there are other verbs that are not necessarily phrasal verbs, but they have a preposition that might commonly go with it, in which case the dictionary should list that and give that information. Or just other words that make a phrase, a common phrase that is used with that word. Very helpful to have that information. And finally, the last thing that I think all great learner dictionaries should have is some example sentences. A whole sentence using the word or the phrase appropriately in a natural way, not something that's directly translated in any sense or shape unnatural, but just a common sentence or an easy to understand sentence illustrating clearly the meaning of the word. It seems to be a far better skill to learn vocabulary in context than merely by itself. Now, how to learn vocabulary itself is another topic, and there will actually be a Language Fuel Academy course coming soon. It's in the pipeline on how best to work with flashcards. That's one method of learning vocabulary, and having lots of examples in context is one of those key points there. So anyway, I guess my point here is there is not necessarily a one correct answer as to whether or not you should be using dictionaries in assessments, or whether or not electronic dictionaries are acceptable, but it is very important to teach your students how to use dictionaries appropriately and how to choose a good one. If they're going to invest a little bit of money, they may as well spend some money on a great dictionary that's going to help them in their learning journey. And I wouldn't necessarily discourage the use of electronic dictionaries or apps that can provide a quick translation when necessary, but as long as the learners understand that there are far better quality dictionaries that they can use. Thank you for listening to the Language Fuel podcast. You can navigate to the show notes and links via our homepage at www.languagefuel.com. Obviously, if you're in New Zealand, see you next time. Contact us. All right, well, that is it for our topic today. I hope you've enjoyed it, found a couple of nuggets of things to think about there, and until next time, ka kite anō.